I'm José Alvarez, the faculty director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU. Together with the National University of Singapore's Center for International Law, we have put together two panels. One occurred already and is available for viewing on YouTube. So in that one, the whole panel is about ASEAN, China, and the U.S. triangle, navigating in a post-Ukraine Russia world. The first session consisted of a keynote by Ambassador Tommy Koh, followed by a moderated panel on economic issues facing ASEAN and its interlocutors, moderated by my NYU colleague, Joseph Weiler. Today's 90 minutes will be devoted to geopolitical challenges, but it's fair to say that Ambassador Tommy Koh's keynote address already teed up some of the issues before us. I will remind folks who have not followed this issue as closely as our very illustrious panel, which I will introduce shortly, that we have put two documents on our website. We could have put many more, but one is the joint vision statement issued by the ASEAN and the White House back in May after the White House summit meeting, which is a quite interesting joint statement that lays out the joint, let's just say, recipes for the future between the ASEAN states and the Biden administration. And it covers everything from cooperating on COVID to promoting maritime cooperation to cooperating on science, technology, and engineering, to supporting sub-regional development, addressing climate change, and nuclear disarmament. So it's quite a comprehensive document, at least in terms of topics. We have also put on, and perhaps by way of comparison, the major foreign policy address given by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken back in May 26, 2022. And I will leave the panelists to the extent that they are inclined to compare the two, the gaps or perhaps contradictions between how the U.S. sees ASEAN in terms of the geopolitical challenges seen from the perspective of Washington versus what was stated in the vision statement. Let me briefly introduce our illustrious panel in alphabetical order. First, we have Peter Dutton, who is the interim dean at the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College. He is formerly director of the China Maritime Studies Institute and teaches in strategic research and also in law, specifically focus on China's maritime expansion, its views of sovereignty and international law shaping China's rise. He's a retired Navy judge advocate, former naval flight officer. He holds a PhD from King's College London, a JD from the College of William and Mary, and also an MA. He is an adjunct professor here at NYU, is well known to us also as the faculty advisor of USALI, the U.S. Asia Law Institute. The next up is Professor Fujiwara. He's a professor of international politics, director of the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, where he graduated from. He was also a Fulbright scholar at Yale, and he moved to the Institute of Social Science and has taught at Graduate School for Law and Politics since 1999. He's the author of numerous books: Remembering the War, Democratic Empire, Is There a Just War, Peace for Realists, International Politics and Conditions of War. He writes a monthly column for Asahi, and he's also, interestingly enough, a weekly film reviewer. So there's a cosmopolitan aspect to Professor Fujiwara. Next up is Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan. He is the former ambassador at large in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore between 2001 and 2013. He was first the second permanent secretary and then the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He joined the civil service back in 1981, I believe, as a foreign service officer. He has served in a variety of appointments, including as Singapore's permanent representative to the UN, ambassador to the Russian Federation, and also to Finland. He studied at Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University. If you look at his Wikipedia entry, he is not just listed as a frequent commentator on Singapore politics and foreign affairs, but quote, is often referred to as Singapore's undiplomatic diplomat, close quote. I urge him to be as undiplomatic as possible during this panel. Susan Thornton is a retired senior U.S. diplomat with 3 decades of experience in the U.S. State Department, Eurasia, and East Asia. She's currently a senior fellow, visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School, and connected to its China Center. She is also the director of the Forum on Asia Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Until July 2018, she was the acting assistant secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and led East Asia policymaking amid crises with North Korea, escalating trade tensions with China, fast-changing, obviously, international environment, which is, of course, the topic of our panel today. I believe that is our 4 very illustrious panels which cover expertise in diplomacy, international relations, and international law. So let me tee up the first question as a sort of way to bridge the 2 panels. So those viewing this who were not able to see the first panel missed the keynote address by Ambassador Tommy Koh. And it's fair to say that Ambassador Koh was focusing on 6 recommendations that he had for how ASEAN should respond, especially to the U.S.-China rivalry in light of situations like Ukraine and all the other current challenges, including to global supply chains, ongoing COVID, et cetera. Very briefly, the 6 recommendations were ASEAN should continue to have better relations with both the US and China than either of those 2 countries have with each other. Second, that it should continue to maintain its neutrality and unity. Third, that it should continue, that ASEAN should continue to keep the conversation going between the US and China in various forums, not just in ASEAN. And that the group should encourage China and the US not to decouple their economies, and also should discourage those 2 giants from not starting a new Cold War by attempting to build rival coalitions of countries that are forced to take sides. And finally, he urged that ASEAN should encourage joint efforts at common interests. That is, making sure that the US and China continue to talk about global challenges like the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, climate change, sustainability, et cetera. As another panelist put it in that first panel, in short, ASEAN should be a buffer, also a beneficiary, and also a mediator when it comes to navigating the relationships with others, including the US, Japan, and China. So I'll start with you, Ambassador. How do you react to Tommy Koh's prescriptions? Do you agree with them, disagree? It's all yours.
Well, there's nothing to disagree, but they are recommendations. The issue is how you implement them. And that's not so clear. Right? If we could implement all of Tommy's recommendations, there'll be no issue. I think we have to start from the premise that Southeast Asia is an arena of great power competition, always has been, and probably always will be. So we have learned to live with this. Tommy is an idealist. He's a Platonist. You know, he believes in the ideal forms, right? But I don't, right? So my question is, how do you do this? And that's not so evident. Let me just, I don't want to take up all the time. I want to be very brief. Just let me take up a couple of points. ASEAN should be neutral. Yes, of course we are neutral. But neutrality is a Protean term, you know. People mean different things by it. I think what ASEAN means by it, when we say we want to be neutral, we don't want to choose, you know, is really that we have already chosen. We have chosen our own interests. Sometimes our interests may appear to take us in the direction of the United States. Sometimes they may appear to take us in the direction of China, or Japan, or Australia, or India, or Botswana. But it's always our own interest, all right? Second point I want to make is this issue of decoupling. I think it's not possible. I really dislike this trope of U.S.-China competition being described as a new Cold War. That's profoundly misleading. U.S.-Soviet Union competition was competition between two systems that were really connected only very tangentially. But the United States and China are both vital and irreplaceable parts of a single system, of which all of us, Singapore, whoever you choose, are connected. And we are connected by supply chains of complexity, of a density, and of a scope never before seen in world history. And I find it very difficult to conceive of this single system bifurcating into two completely different systems. Partial bifurcation has occurred, will continue to occur in specific domains. But just give you one example. We all know that semiconductors, especially the high end, is a serious Chinese vulnerability, because all the most vital nodes in the semiconductor supply chain are held by the US, its allies, its friends, and its partners. All right, so that is, but it's a very serious Chinese vulnerability. However, China is 40% of the global semiconductor market, and you cannot possibly cut off your companies, your own companies, your friends, allies, and partners from 40% of the global market without doing them grievous damage. And that gives an entirely different complexion to competition. In other words, the Cold War is competition between two systems. This is competition within one system, right? And that's a far more complex type of competition. Complexity causes problems to all of us in ASEAN, for example. It's harder to deal with, but it also creates agency. The choices are not binary, they are never binary. And there's always agency. Final point, and I think ASEAN's instinct, diplomatic instinct, ingrained by centuries of living within great power competition. U.S.-China competition is just the latest iteration of a phenomenon we have lived with for a long time. Our diplomatic instinct is naturally polygamous. It is not monogamous. We are never going to align all our interests neatly in one direction or another. In one domain, we may align them or appear to align them in one direction, another domain, another direction, but it is always our interest. And this is a complex region, it's a messy region, and in that messiness, there is agency.
Thank you. Quite interesting. Professor Fujiwara, would you like to comment on Tommy Koh's 6 prescriptions?
Thank you, Jose. First of all, I should say that ASEAN has been the most successful regional organization outside Europe. The character is quite different, and we can't really compare the European Union and ASEAN, but just take a look at the world outside Europe, and you don't see functional regional organization with a group solidarity. You wouldn't find it in South America, you don't find it in South Asia. ASEAN has a very unique history. Now, of course, Sino-US conflict is one cause that may make things difficult for ASEAN to maintain coherence. And I fully understand Ambassador Koh's 6 points, which reflects on the success of ASEAN and the intent to carry on such success in the future. But I do have to say, on the other hand, that there is a serious geopolitical conflict that is taking place in East Asia, which has been accelerated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The 6 points that Ambassador Koh has made is almost identical to the wishes of Mr. Kishida before becoming Prime Minister, or for that matter, Foreign Minister Hayashi. Both of them are known to be moderates in foreign policy. They don't really want to have a tough geopolitical position against China dominating Sino-Japanese or Sino-American relations. And there's an irony here, however, that Prime Minister Abe, who was more focused on geopolitical tension with China, actually ended up being more moderate because he wanted to maintain good trade relations with China. And this refers to what the ambassador has said right now. The conflict we see is multi-layered. We see geopolitical competition, to say the least, between China and the United States, and for that matter, China and Japan, one. But on the other hand, there are other layers. When it comes to trade and commerce, the Japanese interest would be more placed on institutions and support of economic activities rather than securitizing such market matters. And most certainly, there will be strong attention to global issues such as environment or pandemic, which should bring the nations together. So it's a multi-layered structure that we see. And I certainly agree with Ambassador Kausikan that this cannot be characterized as a renewal of the Cold War. Having said that, the trouble here is that security tension can continue on the one hand, while trade relations may prosper. It's an irony. On the one hand, we might think that trade relations would lead to easing geopolitical tension. We don't see that, and that's a problem. And on the other hand, there is a possibility that geopolitics might hinder the development of market relations. We don't see that either. So we have conflict going on the geopolitical terrain, while efforts are being made to maintain good trade relations. So it's an irony in itself. But I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I welcome interventions on Tommy Ko on the role of ASEAN, especially the short-term goals of ASEAN versus long-term, in light of the challenges that both of our speakers, Peter or Susan, would you like to intervene?
Susan, why don't you go first? I'll take it up after you.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much, and great to be here with all of you. I mean, I think, you know, as Professor Bilahari mentioned, I mean, the statements from Tommy Ko are kind of hard to disagree with, but they are quite ideal. And then the question is in the sort of putting things in practice. I mean, I think on the first point, I mean, certainly having better relations with the U.S. and China than they have with each other is pretty easy at the moment. But, you know, as Bilahari indicated, I think it's a smart strategy, of course, for ASEAN. It allows for balancing. It allows maximum flexibility. It gives them more agency, which is something that I've written about in the context of this great power contest. But it also is going to be very difficult, I think, to navigate, maybe perhaps especially for ASEAN. And we see the shades of this now with the conflict in Ukraine, which isn't even directly related to China. I think another thing that Bilahari said that really resonated with me is the complexity of the challenges that we're facing now, and how hard it is to deal with them. We see the U.S. showing a preference for kind of dealing in smaller, stripped down, kind of like-minded combinations of countries where it can get things done relatively expediently. And that sort of stands in stark contrast to the usual dynamics that we see in confabs with ASEAN, where things move kind of slowly, incrementally, it's complicated. So, you know, I'm not sure how that kind of impetus that we see on the part of the Biden administration, of course, they're in a hurry, it's urgent, there are a lot of crises and they need to get things done. But that doesn't normally work very well with the way that ASEAN functions. And also the other thing that I see that's a potential disconnect is this notion of ASEAN operating from an interest-based approach, which is very true, I think, in the history of ASEAN and what we've, at least my experience. And so ASEAN's bound to be very uncomfortable with this Biden administration framing of democracies versus autocracies, which is—
We don't take it seriously.
I know, but and I'm not sure how seriously the Biden administration takes it, but in some senses, it is showing up in some of our policy impulses. So, you know, that I think the Biden administration knows that this, you know, isn't going to work with ASEAN, and it would, you know, fracture the unity in ASEAN clearly. But again, it's a framing device that's used, and it's surfacing problems in a lot of our kind of relationships with longstanding institutions around the world. On decoupling, I agree that decoupling is overblown, but I do think in the technology area, this is going to come to press on ASEAN maybe more directly than most other places in the world. The trend isn't really clear at the moment, but I think it will end up being a difficult thing to navigate for ASEAN. And certainly on the issue of encouraging U.S. China cooperation on global interests, I mean, I think ASEAN and everyone else should be doing that, but it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Hopefully something will change. But I think continuing to press on that is what we should be doing.
So I have an interest in keeping the conversation within all of you. So I encourage you to intervene, especially raising hands in response to each other. Before we turn to Peter Dutton's reaction to this, I also want to urge the audience to intervene by putting your questions in the Q&A box. I will be looking at it throughout and weaving in your questions to the extent it makes sense. Susan, you started your comment before we turn to Peter with sort of joking about, well, it's easy for ASEAN to have better relations given how low the relationship is between U.S. and China at the moment. And I guess for outside folks not connected inside the U.S., there is a bit of a mystery about just how low we have come. And so I just want to ask you, since you were an insider to the administrations in DC, in Blinken's address, he called China the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. And throughout his speech, there was more talk about the various things he thinks China was doing that threatens that order. And I guess that might surprise some people who expected that with the change from Trump to Biden, there would be a much more softening of the rhetoric as well as realities with respect to China. Can you explain briefly to the outside audience why there hasn't been that dramatic change? Why the Biden administration seems to have about as harsh a rhetoric, or perhaps you disagree, as the Trump administration?
Yeah, I do think actually, Jose, that the rhetoric from the Biden administration has softened. Again, that's not hard, right? I mean, we had speeches by the vice president and secretary of state in the last administration, Trump administration, that bordered on kind of calling for regime change in China. So I think the change in rhetoric on that score has been quite clear, and Biden has repeatedly stated these kind of 5 no's. We don't want a new Cold War. We're not building an alliance to contain China. We don't support Taiwan independence. So he's given a number of sort of oral and rhetorical reassurances. I mean, I think the problem isn't really with the rhetoric, although, you know, I think it could still be better. But I think the problem is really with the sort of absence of diplomacy. Certainly COVID comes in here, where the two sides really haven't been able to talk to each other at a high level. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. But I also think that on the actions front, you know, things really haven't changed much from the Trump administration, and that's a problem. So I think the question about whether China wants to, you know, in the Trump national security strategy, China was named a revisionist along with Russia and said that they want to overturn the current international system. I think there's a lot of debate in the China watching community in the U.S. about that, even though the Biden administration seems to have adopted that view. I think it's still an unsettled question among experts. But the question really is one that actually Tommy Koh raised in his opening, in his remarks, which is, you know, this is a very unique and serious, you know, major power rivalry. It's probably going to end either in conflict or it's going to end in some kind of negotiated adjustments to the current order. And what those are, what China would want there, what anyone would be willing to give them is really questions that are still outstanding, I think. But in terms of the Biden administration, they're also very, you know, we should acknowledge, politically constrained. And this bipartisan support in the US for a harder, tougher policy of sort of bordering on containment against China, I would say, is what Biden inherited and hasn't really been able to alter much. And of course, he's got a lot of other things on the plate too, we should acknowledge.
So Peter, now is your turn.
Yeah.
And there is a question in the box you might want to look at, and that is, can ASEAN as a political grouping survive a possible conflict, whether cold or hot, between the US and China, Russia, if the great tribal rivalries take a turn to the worse? And I guess that also reminds me a bit, and Susan alluded to this, that Tommy Koh started his speech by saying there can only be one, I believe he used the word tiger, but I would say one king of the hill. You are a student of history. Is this an unprecedented challenge where there is arguably a declining great power facing a rising one? That sounds actually a bit familiar in history.
That's awfully loaded. All those words are loaded. I'll come back to that. So I want to respond first to the initial question about Tommy Koh's points, because like my fellow panelists here, I don't think we should be using the term Cold War to describe the current situation. And I don't think we're headed in that direction either. We need to define it on its own terms, on its own set of circumstances that very importantly combines both rivalry, right? There is sort of internal rivalry for what Bilahari exactly is correct to say is what is the future of the one system that we're all going to be operating in. But and the second is that that rivalry is destabilizing. I should say, since I am still employed by the federal government, these are my own views, not anybody else's. The second aspect, in addition to rivalry, is interdependence, right? We have to think of these two things as part of the system together. And so ASEAN stands interdependent with not just China and the United States and each other, but with the rest of the world. I'll come back to that point in a minute, but they do stand interdependent in the midst of this larger rivalry. So even though there's interdependence, as Susan and others have pointed out, there's going to be some disconnect, right? The economic disconnect. There has to be. We've learned through COVID that national resilience is sort of, it's a national responsibility, and that there are some limits to international economic integration that are not necessarily entirely in the national interest. And so national security is another one. We talked about the microchips, et cetera. So we do have to recognize that there's going to be some sort of tension between figuring out what states need to do to be resilient and secure, while also participating actively in the international interdependent system. My third point is security alignments are also inevitable, right? So we see AUKUS, we see the evolving U.S.-Japan alliance, et cetera. We see the five powers defense arrangement, right? Sort of the reinvigoration of that in the new set of circumstances. And China's growth and its projection of its power in the international system is inevitably going to have some sort of reaction from states. And so states will inevitably want to manage their own interests in terms of their security through collective action. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. ASEAN is in fact working together cooperatively to find ways to look out for each other's interests in the midst of this sort of roiling international set of circumstances. A fourth and last point is that, like the title of our topic today is Navigating a Post-Ukraine World, right? So I think the key point to make is in this larger interdependence, security, both national physical security and economic security, are global. We have to recognize that there is a global system, a global security system and a global economic system and all states participate in, and it's not simply a regional system. ASEAN cannot think of itself as simply a regional security or a regional political arrangement that is independent of the rest of what's going on around the globe. Like it or not, ASEAN security, both economic and physical, is inextricably linked to, for instance, Ukraine's and to all other states. For example, I mean, we just saw today Xi Jinping's birthday, and his birthday call was to Vladimir Putin, and they had a very congenial conversation in which Xi Jinping gave much more overt support for Russia and what's going on with the Ukraine conflict. We can discuss this together again in a minute, but what we have to come back to is this idea of all states are interdependent and have a stake in the future of what this single system is going to look like. So even though ASEAN does not want to choose sides, they're not on the sidelines, right? This is the key point. It's not necessary to choose sides, but all states are involved because of this interconnectedness. So states are neither on the sidelines, nor must they take sides, but they are involved in the future evolution of the global order. I think that's the key. And ASEAN has so much to offer in terms of the values that will comprise the future of the international order, that it's important that they understand that they're not on the sidelines.
Any of the other panelists want to comment on anything you've heard from each other so far before I proceed? No raised hands, no immediate interventions. So let's, since Peter just put it on the table, this isn't the first time that the presidents of Russia and China have declared that their friendship is, quote, without limits. And let's face it, as an international lawyer, my own view is that the invasion of Ukraine is outright aggression, and it's only the veto in the Security Council that prevents the Security Council from actually taking the legally binding sanctions that it has taken when other countries have committed aggression. So therefore, I guess I'm not terribly keen on Ambassador Koh's pointing out that there's no legal obligation on anyone to respond to aggression simply because the Security Council hasn't acted. At least in international law, many of us think that ergo omnes and jus cogens violations are serious ones, irrespective of whether the Security Council can muster 9 votes. And there is the possibility of acting in such a way to aid and abet aggression that would make another country complicit in aggression. So I guess I want to put to the panel the question of, isn't this a real existential threat to the international system that could not be ignored while still being consistent with international law, and therefore not taking sides with respect to, say, sanctions on Russia is in effect taking sides against a basic premise of the UN Charter? Anyone want to answer that question? Yes, Ambassador.
Look, I think, frankly, international law is beside the point here. It is a question of interest. This is a kind of situation where the UN system cannot work. In fact, it's a kind of system where the UN system is designed not to work so it doesn't blow up. That's why you have the veto. But I think most countries understand the principles involved, but it's a question of interest. Look at ASEAN, right? Set aside Myanmar because it's a bit of an anomaly in this case, because the person representing Myanmar in the UN is not the SAC. You look at things. Vietnam cannot be very happy about this, but Vietnam has certain interests, a long-standing relationship with Russia, and more to the point, a huge stock of Russian weapons that they need to keep operational. So they can't take the same position as, say, Singapore, right? Look at Cambodia, which happens to be ASEAN chair. Cambodia not only supported the UN resolution, but it co-sponsored it because their interests are such they can understand. They were invaded and occupied once. I think we should not take this as it's a huge development. It's a huge challenge to a particular concept of the international order. And I think most countries understand that. But that's the level of principle. Most countries also have different interests. The Biden administration, as Americans are wont to do, bless your souls, likes to frame things in terms of democracy versus autocracy. Well, India, as people often want to say, is the world's largest democracy, but it has different interests in this case. You're going to see an adjustment over the long term in countries' relations with Russia. I mean, those countries like India, Vietnam, who have got large stocks, let's say, of Russian weapons, are going to adjust this thing over the long term, very long term, because it's not something that we can done like that, overnight. So it is a major event, but let's not try to make it the touchstone of everything, which it would be if you take it from a purely international legal perspective.
Thank you. Others on this, Susan?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that during the voting in the UN, people knew that Russia was going to veto, right? So the question about sanctions that are not UN designed sanctions, I think, of course, people could take the vote in support of the resolution knowing that they weren't going to have to implement sanctions. So that you have to factor that into the reality of the voting. Certainly the sanctions that were imposed cannot be equally kind of levied by all countries, especially given the heavy emphasis on financial sanctions. What Singapore did was implement some sanctions, but not, they don't have the wherewithal to sort of levy a broad range of sanctions the way countries with a major financial sort of systems involved in the international system, Russian clearing, all of that could do. So I think Cambodia's stance was, I thought, very interesting, where they talked about standing up for the principle in international law. And I think most countries, you saw the large number of votes in favor. So I don't think we should say that international law completely failed in this case, but there are special circumstances, as Ambassador Bilahari is indicating, that in every vote, but especially in this one, it's a pretty unique circumstance. So, and I think the point about keeping the UN from blowing up, there's a lot of issues with the UN, but certainly the permanent 5 vetoes probably are designed for this kind of thing. So I don't find it as discouraging, I don't think, Jose, as you do. Of course, the Russian behavior is extremely alarming and discouraging, but overall, the response, I think, has been, pretty consolidated around the response to Russia.
Thank you. Ambassador, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make one point. Look, international law is many things. In this case, it's a vocabulary. It's a vocabulary to express your interest. And as far as sanctions is concerned, I would take a bet. We in Singapore generally do not recognize nor impose unilateral sanctions. But in this case, it's a special case. There can't be UN Security Council sanctions for the obvious reasons. But I'll take you a bet that most countries will comply with the unilateral sanctions of other countries in their own interest, because most countries have more interest in the American economy, the European economy, than the Russian economy. So it is wrong to frame this, except it is international, it is a very egregious violation of some very fundamental norms of international conduct, which are usually expressed in international legal terms. But fundamentally, this is not a legal issue. International law is a vocabulary that we all use for our own purposes. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Tommy is going to kill me, of course.
So I hear Professor, I see Professor Fujiwara, and then Peter.
Yes, quite briefly, I would say that there are several layers, again, of international norms. And when it comes to a direct invasion and annexation of territory by use of force, this is a violation of one of the most basic norms written in the UN Charter. This is not an expanded ideological position on human rights or democracy. There is a very wide gap here. And when it comes to maintaining sovereignty and coherence, integrity of one's territory, I think a larger number of nations support that position. Now, what measure they can agree upon is yet another story. When it comes to sanctions against Russia, we can see that the UN, US and US allies have been strongly supporting that, but the support is pretty weak outside that group. So, and then of course, the United Nations is not suited for facing a direct violation of the UN Charter by P5. But having said that, one thing that we have to make clear is that Russia did invade. China has not annexed a territory by use of force in such magnitude. There's a difference here. Doesn't mean that China won't do it. There is a distinction between Russia and China, which might disappear pretty quickly. And there is a debate in Japan going on that we should take both Russia and China together as our foe, or whether we can bring China into a slightly different position from Russia. Now, I do believe that there is a hope shared by the Kishida administration on that point, especially with Chinese interest in maintaining good trade relationship. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Peter, you had an interview.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to respond to that. Well, in part the question in the chat, but I want to make a point about Bilahari's talked about states following interests, and it's right. It's true. Vietnam is moving very differently from Cambodia, for instance, in relationship to Ukraine. But I think we have to make a distinction between narrow national interest, right? So very specific national interests, and sort of broader, or you might call them enlightened interests, where in the end, states can pursue their narrow national interests when they don't perceive that the international disruption is going to fundamentally alter the international system. But if there's a sense that the system is insecure, that their ability to operate within the larger system is insecure, then states are more likely to come together to defend the actual system, or what they think the system should develop into. And so I think it's an interesting observation that we're seeing that Vietnam and Cambodia actually perceive some space to operate, because perhaps they don't see the Russia-Ukraine conflict as being a fundamental systemic challenge. I wonder if that's in fact true. I agree with you, Jose, that what we're observing is just blatant aggression in this case, without frankly any legitimizing narrative surrounding it. And so international law is a really important tool. I agree in the sense that it's the language through which we express our values and the values that regulate and stabilize this international system. So I'm actually quite, I'm a bit more concerned about the overall health of the system, not because of the U.S. China rivalry, as much as because of the willingness of states, some states, including Russia, to act entirely without a reference to the values of the system that we all I think are so important. I think that's the issue for ASEAN today. Where do you actually see the system and its health? And if you agree with me that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is an important canary in the coal mine about the health of the system, then it's time to step up and take more active measures.
So on that point, in I believe it was yesterday's New York Times, there was an editorial by a conservative writer who said the reason Ukraine matters is key to Asia, because whatever happens there might predict what happens in Taiwan. So I want to put the Taiwan issue on the table. And of course, Peter, we can start with you with Taiwan. And I guess the narrow question is, what is the status of the Taiwan Strait? And what do you think about President Biden's statements while he was in Japan, that the US would intervene militarily should there be an invasion of Taiwan? Is the invasion of Taiwan less or more likely because of Ukraine? And I want to just put the Taiwan question squarely to this panel. Starting with you, Peter.
Boy, okay, thanks. So I think one of the things I'd like to say about the recent statements at the Shangri-La Dialogue related to the Taiwan Strait is that I read China's approach to the Taiwan Strait to be more normative in terms of the international law and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea than many people have, in part because parsing it very carefully, I think the Chinese were attempting to say something very straightforward about international law as it applies there. What they're really talking about is politics, the politics of naval activities around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And this is an issue where they're focused not just on the United States, but also on other countries, most recently Australia and Canada, I think, have felt Chinese pressure in the region. So I think I think what the Chinese are trying to get us to focus on is the politics, the political dynamics, as opposed to the legal dynamics. And if you like, I can explain that in some detail. But what I think it's really important to think about is that there's a distinction between how President Biden has sort of chosen to frame his views on Taiwan. Again, these are my personal opinions, and his his sort of strong feeling about American interests and American relationship to Taiwan, and the fact that American policy in regard to Taiwan has not changed over the last roughly 50 years, actually. So, so here, what I think has, however, gotten lost in the larger conversation has been this hyper focus on the defense balance, on the sort of balance of coercive power that each side can bring to the table, forgetting that for 50 years we've had a rather stabilizing set of policies that it's important that our country, our administration reaffirm in order to reassure China that we're not trying to look for Taiwan independence or any separate status from its overall relationship to China. So so that's an important point to reassure China in that regard, and therefore I think help to lower the military tensions across the strait. And I was pleased to see in the more recent statements, Secretary Blinken reinforced all of those points, the reassuring points that come out of the various communiques and the way we've interacted with each other over the years, where it's essentially a dual deterrence policy, right? It's deterring the use of coercive power across the strait between PRC and Taiwan, but also deterring any sort of movement toward overt independence on Taiwan's part. That's the reassurance I think that we need to continue to reinforce.
Professor Fujiwara, were you surprised by Biden's statements about the U.S. willingness to intervene militarily? Do you think that was a change in the position of the administration? And what do you think, moreover, about its wisdom?
Mr. Biden has made similar statements in the past and then changed position slightly, and also followed by statements from the Department of State that this is not a change of policy. So I can't say that we're really much surprised. And also, I'd like to point out that although Kishida, and for that matter, Hayashi, seems to be in support of Biden's position, I believe Washington's position is a bit more nuanced, like Peter pointed out. Tokyo's interest is stronger security assurance from the United States. There is much focus on strengthening alliance relationship, and of course Tokyo is willing to pay more in the defense budget. Having said that, Tokyo is not interested in provoking China at all. And also, I very much doubt if the Japanese government believes that China is about to invade Taiwan, regardless of what, pundits in the media says. And I think that the consensus view is China is not likely to start a war in Taiwan, especially after Ukraine. But at the same time, Japan wants more security assurance from the United States. And for that, we are moving toward more attention to the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but not necessarily Taiwan. These two are slightly different, I should say.
Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, I would just say that on the question of a timeline, vis-a-vis Taiwan, I don't think that Ukraine has much impact on that. I think it's been completely overblown. I think Biden's comments in Tokyo have also been over-examined, but I do think that the US is over-focused on deterrence. And frankly, the US can impact the timeline on Taiwan. We can either accelerate the timeline or we can push it back. And I'm afraid, without going into great detail because it's extremely complicated, but I'm afraid that we are in the process of accelerating, mainly because the issue has become captive of sort of political and media narratives that we don't seem to be able to withdraw from. So I'm quite worried about this, but not because of Ukraine.
Well, Susan, I guess I want to ask you, there's a lot of pointing fingers, right? With China saying, U.S. are basically undermining the one China policy by supporting Taiwan's defense budget, by arming them, etc. And the U.S. saying, no, it's you. You're sending these flights over. You are talking about responding, and when combined with your other approaches to the international order and the endorsement of Ukraine, we think you're changing. Do you think that this all ends up in the wash, that they're both guilty on Taiwan? Quite apart from the media.
Yeah, I mean, there's a game afoot about who is it that's changing the status quo, because the U.S. keeps saying that we support the continuation of the status quo. Taiwan says it supports the continuation of the status quo. China doesn't really ever say that, but they certainly are not interested in being painted as the aggressor. But I think, really the issue isn't about who's doing what, because this is an issue that the Chinese have made very clear is basically, core national interest. They're not they have a law that says if, the unification appears to be going out of reach, they have a law that requires them to move. And I think, in that situation, deterrence and this kind of escalating security dilemma that we've gotten ourselves in, accompanied by very dramatic and incessant political and media narratives, is very dangerous.
Ambassador, this is a good time for the undiplomatic diplomat to say a few words about Taiwan. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I don't think China will ever give up the aspiration for reunification, or give up the option to do it forcefully. That said, I don't think they are eager to go to war over this. But as General Wei made very clear to Shangri-La, if there is a unilateral declaration of independence, they will go to war, whether they win or lose. I mean, he didn't use those words, but that's how I read it. That said, I think there are two sides to this equation. I don't think war is imminent, not war by design anyway. Right? Accidents can happen, and accidents can happen in the South China Sea, East China Sea. It can happen anywhere. But an accident in the Taiwan Strait will be much more difficult to contain, because it is a neuralgic issue to China, and it intersects very directly the narrative of the China Dream. However, I think if nobody will know, I mean, if I were a PLA general or Xi Jinping, I will be thinking very carefully about the lessons of Ukraine for an operation against Taiwan. However, there are, I think, as Susan alluded to, or somebody alluded to, there are two sides to this equation. Maybe it was you, Peter. The Taiwanese side is something, what lessons are the Chinese taking from Ukraine? Equally important, what lessons are the Taiwanese taking from Ukraine? Right? Taiwanese domestic politics is very volatile. And that, to me, is the bigger X factor, apart from an accident. So I wouldn't overplay, overemphasize the effect of Ukraine on the Taiwan Straits. But there will be an effect. But, I mean, basically, I am much more concerned about what lessons are the Taiwanese taking. Will they take the lesson that somebody's going to defend me anyway, so don't worry? Or will they take the lesson, if I am able to defend myself, then perhaps I can I can expect some international support. Look, Taiwanese capability to defend themselves has degraded over the years. That's a fact. And they have to do something about it. It's not a legal issue, it's a political issue. I think, Peter, you said that, right? And it's a question of deterrence. How do you best maintain deterrence? The US is one factor, but the Taiwan side is another factor. And that's the bigger X factor to my mind.
Thank you. So I don't see a hand up on follow-up on this question, but inspired in part by one of the questions in the chat box. The question is, ASEAN countries clearly have different interests. What is it that holds them together in ASEAN? And I guess I want to press the point, especially because it's been stressed, the difference between Cambodia and Vietnam on positions with respect to Russia. And so there's a lot of talk of ASEAN centrality and a lot of talk, including by Tommy Koh, of ASEAN unity. But I'm wondering what the there is. That is, when I press the question of whether in the first panel, that was the only question that I posed was, well, what exactly is ASEAN's position on a number of pending issues, whether it's investor state reform or the reform of the WTO? The response I got was, well, there was once a time when ASEAN issued statements of joint policy positions, but that is no longer happening. So I guess I'll start with you, Ambassador. What is ASEAN exactly? That is,
all right,
when
very
people
simple,
say
very
ASEAN
simple.
centrality, what is that?
I'll come to ASEAN centrality, but we can take the entire remaining time to talk about that. But let me just get to the core point. What is ASEAN? ASEAN is a mechanism for managing relations among countries for maintaining a minimal level of civility and stability in relations among its members. That is the fundamental purpose of ASEAN. Right? Everything else we do is, in a way, a means to that end. We are not, and we will never be, a band of brothers singing in perfect harmony. If we were indeed a band of brothers singing in perfect harmony, there would be no need for ASEAN. Okay. The secondary purpose is, because we can maintain a minimal level of civility and stability in relations where this is not to be taken for granted, that the secondary purpose is to maintain autonomy amidst great power relations. Because if we were more disunited openly than we were, there will be more opportunity for major powers to intervene in not just regional affairs, internal affairs of various countries, as has happened in the not so distant past, as you can see, as you can all remember. So those are the two fundamental purposes of ASEAN. Everything else is secondary. We don't pretend to have a common position on every issue, and we can't. And if we try, it would actually make the region more incoherent. And in that fundamental purpose of maintaining a minimal level of stability and civility in relations, ASEAN has been extremely successful. I think all of us on this panel are old enough to remember Southeast Asia before ASEAN, or when ASEAN was first formed. Right now, Southeast Asia has its problems, has its challenges, but by and large, the region is stable, at peace, and relatively prosperous compared to other regions. So that is the fundamental purpose of ASEAN. Let's not get carried away by what we say we are going to do, because that's not what we really exist in order to do.
Comments by others? Susan, do you want to say anything about ASEAN's fundamental purpose and whether you agree with the assessment that it's the most effective organization outside of the EU?
Well, I think I've heard Ambassador Bilahari on this subject many, many times, and so I can't disagree with him. But I do think it depends on what your perspective is and what you're hoping for from ASEAN, and certainly from the perspective of kind of keeping peace and stability. in the region. I think ASEAN's done incredibly well from the perspective of promoting prosperity. It's done very well. I don't know if I could say outside the EU that it's the most effective. I wouldn't want to wade into those waters, but I do think that it's important, and it's difficult to keep these 10 kind of dissonant voices together, but it's been managed, I think, pretty effectively up to now.
Peter, did you want to say something on this?
Yeah, I do actually. One of the things that I've always felt was important about ASEAN is that individually, each of these countries is relatively weak. I mean, there's obviously power disparities, but together they're more than the sum of the parts, right? I think that's a really important component of what ASEAN is and can be. That individually the countries are relatively weak, but together it's more than the sum of their parts. Second, I think it's really important to recognize that ASEAN is a really important forum for managing existing regional differences. We tend to think about ASEAN as sort of in relationship to China, or ASEAN in relationship to the US or EU or whatever. But it's internal to ASEAN that I think sometimes some of the most important work gets done. We forget sometimes the degree to which there are remaining territorial disputes among different ASEAN states. I mean, Philippines and Malaysia still have a lingering dispute over the province of Sabah, for instance. It's sort of a little forgotten or long forgotten issue, but still it lingers. And then, of course, there are the island disputes in the South China Sea, but also in the Singapore Strait, right? We've had cases between Malaysia and Singapore litigated over territorial issues, island issues, and how to deal with the maritime domain, for instance. And so I think it's a really important thing to recognize that in addition to being more than the sum of its parts, it holds together the region, which could rather quickly fray because of some of these quite different interests in key issues like territorial claims and maritime claims. So I wanted to add that.
Professor Fujiwara, I think you wanted to comment.
Oh, Peter, you made a great point. When it comes to the original 5 members of ASEAN, I think the coherence would be maintained, with the simple reason being that the original states working together works to their great advantage, to say the least. I don't think the same applies to newcomers when ASEAN expanded membership. When it comes to Cambodia and Myanmar, their position on ASEAN's role in the region would be quite different from other members. And Vietnam, on the other hand, has also a very different view on the utility of ASEAN. So I should add that well, I wouldn't say a gap, but there is a difference between the original members and the new members, which could somehow work against the coherence of ASEAN 10.
Thank you. So I guess I wanted to at least let all of you comment on the ASEAN White House Summit. Did it achieve what it was supposed to achieve? Was it disappointing? Including the joint vision statement, which, by the way, tried to get ASEAN on board on a number of very detailed positions, which perhaps isn't ASEAN's strength, as we've just heard. So anyone want to comment on the White House Summit? Was it a success? And is it really a reset of U.S. relations with the region? Ambassador.
I think the most important thing about the special summit was that it was held. And it was held at a time when a war was going on in Europe. It was held at a time when the war started in Ukraine. There were a number of commentators in our region that thought that the US is going to be distracted, and as it was over the wars in the Middle East, and give China a free ride, right? The most important thing about that summit, which was followed, don't forget, by a trip by President Biden to East Asia and a Quad summit, it showed definitively that the US is indeed capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. And that was a very important lesson to show to the world, right? The substance is not important. The substance was as people expect, right? But it was held. It shows that the US can maintain focus on what it said was its key priority at a time when there was a fairly major war going on in Europe, right? It can do two things at the same time. That's the key importance of that summit.
Fascinating. So you would thank the folks who organized the event more than all the slaves of people at the State Department who actually had to draft the.
Oh no, drafting. Look, when I've been one of those slaves. Most of my career has been one of those slaves. We draft these things because this is what they pay us to do. All right.
Susan, do you have the same view?
Well, I was gonna say exactly the same thing, which is the most important thing is that it was held. And it's a first ever that the leaders coming to Washington. There was a lot of grumbling. These things are really hard to pull off successfully because there's just so many detractors.
Well, see the Summit of the Americas, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So, everyone's going to be talking, all the media narrative will be about who came, who didn't come, and did they get them to do X, Y, or Z, which wasn't the original intent in any case. So I just think having it was great. It was preceded, of course, by the trip by Prime Minister Lee, which I think was also really actually helpful, even though it wasn't supposed to work out that way. I think that was also great. So that was part of this very active period of Asia, East Asian diplomacy by the Biden administration. I mean, there's no phrase, I'm sorry, Bilahari, there's no phrase I hate more than the one about walking and chewing gum. And I don't actually think that we've proven that this proves that we can do that. And I don't think we actually can do that very well, but I think it's good that we managed to give attention, find some time to do.
Right. You can do two things at the same time.
Yeah, I'm not sure that two things at the same time, but I take your point that, they did manage to get this very important, I think symbolically important meeting held. And I think the statement, the drafting, the documents, the nuances there are less important. This is a work in progress. It's really complicated to negotiate things like the IPEF and all of that. So, this meeting allowed us to take a step forward on that, which was great. But the fact of the meeting itself is the most important thing, especially since, frankly, discussions about the Quad have really overshadowed the diplomacy with ASEAN, even though we keep saying ASEAN centrality, but the rhetoric from the Biden administration has really focused a lot on the Quad. So even more important in that context that ASEAN leaders came to Washington.
Ambassador, you had your hand up.
Go ahead, Peter. I'll come in later.
I just wanted to take a slightly different point of view, actually, that I think I think that what I was encouraged by was the repetition of some of the things like rules-based order. We can debate about whether there is a rules-based order, but at least in terms of the maritime domain, which was also reinforced over and over again, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea does in fact provide a rules-based order. And that was reinforced over and over again in the document, and the importance of rules and treaties and agreements and values and the application of them to stabilize the region. The South China Sea, of course, was mentioned over and over again. And I wanted to point out that in a way, there's a really important value to reinforcing the systemic values, right? The idea that just repeating and reinforcing these values and the importance of them, especially since, as we've already discussed here, we've seen in the international system, there are ways in which the values are being challenged, right? And so yes, it's true, probably that the most important thing was that the event occurred, but at the same time, I find it in the midst of these international challenges to various aspects of the rules-based order, that the reinforcement and restatement of those values has an important symbolic value.
Ambassador.
A very quick comment. I don't want to start a side issue, right? When we all say rules-based order, we all agree with it, but we mean something slightly different when we say it, right? Never mind about that. But at least the phrase is there. No, I think what I wanted to say is, I think there was a huge amount of grumbling, Susan, as you know, on our side, ASEAN side, right? Kind of petty grumbling in the lead up to this special summit. But the fact is, it occurred. And I tell you what pleasantly surprised me. What pleasantly surprised me is that 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries signed up to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, even though we all don't really quite know what it means yet. And I took that as a symptom of a larger phenomenon. You know, Singapore has never been shy about saying, I think all of you know this, that the US is an irreplaceable part of any strategic balance in our region, right? We have always said that, and we will continue to say it, and we mean it. However, it was once upon a time considered a rather eccentric Singaporean attitude. And you can see the response to the 1990 MOU, which we signed with the US to let you use some of the facilities after you had to leave the Philippines. And then you see the contrast that there was a hysterical response from our neighbors. Contrast that when we renewed that MOU in 2019, what happened? Nothing happened. There was no response from our neighbors. And in between, in 2005, as you remember, Susan, and maybe you, Peter, we signed a strategic partnership framework agreement, which actually has taken our defense and security cooperation to a level just below your former treaty allies and higher than your former treaty allies in Southeast Asia. What happened? Nothing happened. In other words, the idea that the US is a vital element of the strategic balance is now an accepted strategic reality. Not everybody is prepared to say so publicly, but they understand it, right? And what we do with you is almost a regional common good. Others are doing their own things. They cannot do, they have different constraints, usually for domestic political reasons. But I think that despite all the grumbling, despite the vagueness of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, so many signed up to it is a symptom or a sign that this is recognized now. And that's a very enormous change in strategic outlook in Southeast Asia over the last 20, 30 years. Something that is not often acknowledged, but ought to be acknowledged.
Thank you. So this brings up a question from the panel, from the box, but also one that's been raised before. So this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was discussed quite a bit in the first panel on economic issues, but I'm curious what this panel, focusing perhaps on its geopolitical significance, thinks about it. The sense that we got from the first panel, and I think is probably not uncommon in the region, is that it's either vague, as we've just heard, or certainly falls far short of the US joining the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which apparently is a step too far for the United States, given its internal political dynamics. So I guess I'd start with Professor Fujiwura, since I think it's pretty clear that Japan's government's own preference would be for the US to rejoin the CPTPP. What do you think about this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Is it too little, too late?
Well, it's a political statement that does not include China, but then includes a wide range of nations. When it comes to trade institutions, what matters is the details, really, and we don't see that. When it comes to TPP or CPTPP, there was a tremendous amount of discussion and debates, but we did come out with a pretty strong framework. And it's a pity that the United States left the framework. And frankly speaking, there is much skepticism in Tokyo about Biden's trade policy. Not that the focus is wrong, but whether the administration can really carry it out is an open question. And trade institutions should not be used as political baits. for geopolitics. It just doesn't work that way. And to that extent, I would say that RCEP was a useful framework, but Tokyo would be more interested in expanding CPTPP, and for which, after all, the Japanese government did make very big concessions, actually.
So the CPTPP, and I'll welcome Susan commenting on this as well as others. I'm curious how you see, Professor, the value of it. Many people, I think, in ASEAN are disappointed by the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework precisely because it doesn't have market access. But the CPTPP is more than about market access. It's about harmonization of standards, for instance, which is, pretty important on other. How do you see the value of the CPTPP relative to the RCEP, for instance?
Well, I would support CPTPP rather than RCEP because it's a much dependable framework. But to be very frank, to have India in a trade institution, and the level of institutional arrangements or norms have to be relaxed. It's just a matter of fact in many ways, and that is where RCEP failed in inviting India. And at this moment, I don't really see a great framework at this moment. CPTPP has its limits, but nonetheless, it's by far the more comprehensive institution that we have in the region.
Ambassador, did you hand up for this one, or was it still up?
Oh no, sorry. But let me just make one. It was for the previous one, but let me just make one comment, right? I think we will all prefer the US to come back to the CPTPP, but we know that it's not possible. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is better than nothing. It right now lacks definition, but it is up to us to put some meat onto those bare bones, right? And so I don't dismiss it entirely, but right now it is much more political. However, I want to make one point which ought to be made, which is obvious, but it's often overlooked. The missing economic piece in the Indo-Pacific strategy is a multilateral economic piece. Bilaterally, the US is still a very important economic partner to all of us, almost all of us, right? It is a major investor. The stock of investment in Southeast Asia is the larger, I think, combined than China, Japan, South Korea combined. It is, and the quality of US investment is very high. As far as Singapore is concerned, trade in goods, China is a bigger trading partner, but trade in services, US is far the larger trading partner, and as a preferred employer, the US is the preferred employer. So let's not get too carried away by the missing multilateral economic piece. I don't want to downplay the importance of that. It's important and it's preferable that you plug it, but you can't. So this is better than nothing, but the bilateral aspect should not be forgotten. You are and will remain a key economic player in our region.
Susan, do you have a comment on the partnership?
Well, the most important thing is the regional standards, right? So when you look at CPTPP, the whole idea there was that we were going to try to promote a kind of high standards agreement that the countries in CPTPP would all adopt, and that would set the sort of trade investment platform for the region at a certain level. RCEP, which the US is not in, of course, nor is India in, is a lower standards agreement, certainly than CPTPP. But the thing that it does that I think we need to pay attention to is that it does do a certain amount of harmonization of regional standards and promoting regional integration. And so, once you have that set in motion. If you don't have anything else, then that is going to sort of create its own sort of path dependencies, right? Now, the IPAF, as I see it, is an attempt to sort of try to do standards without an agreement on the part of the U.S. And I don't know if that's going to work. I mean, as the ambassador mentioned, people have signed up to it. They don't really know what it is. But people aren't going to sign up to pay costs unless they see that there's some benefit to them from those costs that they're going to be paying. And so I just think that's an open question. Right now, I think it's pretty easy to sign up to it because, you know, there's no commitment at the beginning to sign up to it. You don't have to commit to anything. So it's pretty easy to sign up. And then we've said there's these 4 pillars and you can opt into one and not the others. So that makes it seem flexible. But the question is going to be as was said, you know, in trade agreements, it's where the rubber meets the road. What is it going to cost and what am I going to get from it? And we don't know that yet. So I think, you know, it's a Japanese colleague of mine said, you know, on IPEF, nice try. But, you know, it doesn't seem to really resonate much in the region. I think it is a way to have an answer to the question, what is the Biden administration's economic strategy in Asia? You can say IPEF now, but it doesn't do a lot more than that at the moment, I don't think. We'll see if it can be fleshed out and become something live.
Right, from the perspective of somebody who's been looking at this for a while, I think its doom is the fact that the Biden administration can't even get fast track authority, which suggests there's really no prospect of a binding trade agreement, much less coming into the TPP because of bipartisan consensus that trade is a bad thing for the U.S. economy and we need to make things in America. That alone, I think, may undermine what the U.S. is saying on this point. It does raise another question, which is sort of the elephant in the room. It's one thing to say that this administration can do more than one thing at a time and walk that way. But it's another question how long can the US walk that way? That is, Biden is not clear that he's going to be reelected, even if he runs. There's the prospect of a President Trump or President DeSantis. Doesn't all of that is the possibility that the US could return to a much less multilateral commitment, including to the region, doesn't that undermine what the summit is all about? Anyone want to comment on the problem that the US democracy is not necessarily consistent?
Well, look, you know, I've dealt with the US almost 40 years, right? In the 40 years, periodically, very often people have asked me, Americans, is the US reliable? My answer has always been, of course, you're not reliable, but you are indispensable. So whether you're reliable or not is moot.
Okay. Let's see. Any other comments?
On that note, I think I have to drop off, Jose, but that's a great answer. So great to see all of you.
Thank you, Susan.
All right,
Appreciate that.
Hi, Susan.
So the rest of you, anyone want to comment on the U.S. And it's the problem?
Well, you are what you are, but we need you. So
okay, well, don't point at me. I'm not representing
you in the collective sense.
Right. So I don't see a hand up on that, but there are a couple of last questions from the box, and we're running out of time, so I'll put them. One is, do people agree that the U.S. sanctions and the European sanctions against Russia will continue to succeed, not necessarily because of sympathy for the US, but because of the US banking system, its global finance, and the pervasive use of the US dollar in international trade? That's a reminder of, I think you, Ambassador, have suggested interests, and realities. Any comment on that?
I'll just say I'm wondering whether we're getting to the point where sanctions are beginning to be overused, to the point where we have to begin to worry about whether our use of sanctions begins to erode the stability of the international banking system with the dollar at its foundation. I don't know the answer to that, but it is something that I'm beginning to wonder.
Professor Fujiwara, did you?
I was about to say the same thing as Peter said.
Sorry.
Finance is one area that has been weaponized, and quite successfully, I should say. But then doesn't mean that it will work, and we don't really know how long it will take. I won't go into the literature here, but sanctions are easy to use in many ways than war. So there is a possibility that sanction can be used too much, and that weakens the efficacy. We will see the result this autumn, but I'm not really sure if sanction will have a decisive impact unless there are domestic conditions in Russia that translates despair into policy.
Well, we're now down to 1 or 2 minutes. Anyone want to have a closing comment that they didn't get to say because I asked the wrong question?
We should always hear from Bilahari.
Please.
Sanction, I know of no example except maybe South Africa, where sanctions have actually changed fundamentally state behavior. However, sanctions are important as a symbol of disapproval of certain norms, and perhaps to deter certain kinds of behavior, not now, but in the future. I too worry about whether we have overused sanctions, but I don't think there is any alternative to the US dollar, to the US banking system. No real alternative. Where is the alternative? So like it or not, we are stuck with it. So we are where we are, and good luck to all of us.
So again, we're indispensable.
Right.
You are. You're not reliable. You have a lot of eccentricities, but we love you anyway.
Right. Well, it's certainly not going to be crypto, it sounds like, as the substitute at this point. But thank you so much for this wonderful exchange and for being willing to engage with each other. I apologize that we didn't get to every question in the Q&A box, but I hope all those listening will appreciate the very interesting discussion that we've had. It's part of many. I suspect we can revisit this ASEAN topic and its interlocutors at some future point. But thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Good night.